From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
And we have returned, as we said at the top of this week's segment. This is the part of the show that may not be appropriate for all listeners. We are delving into something that is both terrifying and real, and one thing that is, in addition to being real and terrifying, immensely depressed. Actually, you know what? This whole part is the downer part of the show. And it is all thanks to our fellow conspiracy realist, Tom, who called in recently with this.
Hey folks, this is Tom. Hearing reports from North Korea that claimed the country had 0 COVID-19 deaths made me think back to the 1980s when Nicolae Ceausescu made similar statements about his country of Romania being free of the AIDS epidemic. I remember the World Health Organization went into Romania after Ceausescu was overthrown and executed, and that the WHO found orphanages or hospitals with children who had been infected with HIV from birth, and the horrible conditions they existed in, where the kids were unused to being held and cared for, and that they had problems acclimating themselves to human touch. I was hoping you could follow up on the lives of the survivors, if any exist, or speak to the dangers of countries sweeping victims under the rug during epidemics as part of their propaganda. If that seems too dark or sad, I'd love for you folks to do a piece on Pentagon Project 100,000 from back in the 1960s. Thanks again. This is Tom. Bye.
Thanks so much, Tom. I massively appreciate this call because it's something that I think a lot of people, especially younger people in the West, are not aware of. Yes, during the time that Romania was a dictatorship, a communist dictatorship particularly, some crazy, horrific things happened because of what was called a natalist policy. Abortion and contraception were forbidden in the country because the dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, believed that unrestricted population growth would naturally one-to-one lead to economic growth. And so back in 1966, he issued something called Decree 770, which banned abortion in all and any cases, including sexual assaults, unless the mother was over 40 years of age or already had borne 4 children or was currently caring for 4 children. So predictably, birth rates rise. They turn up the economic heat later by instituting special taxes for people who didn't have children. And this resulted in tons of births, with tons of children being abandoned in orphanages that were also occupied by people with disabilities, by people with mental illness. HIV comes into play here when we consider the very low standards of cleanliness and care. I mean, this is one of those episodes that I feel has to be an episode because this dictator and his followers and his underlings and his collaborators were very much participating in a conspiracy that has traceable and real consequences even in the modern day. So these kids, were not receiving things like human contact during their formative years. They were not receiving nutrition. There were often, cases of terrible abuse. And then unsterilized instruments led to the transmission of HIV and other diseases, other infections. About 500,000 kids survived what would later be called Romania's slaughterhouse of souls. Before we continue, had you guys heard of this before, Tom?
No, have not.
Yeah, this is it's my first run into it for sure.
Um, there's a Guardian article that you posted here, Ben, and I was kind of making my way through it. It's really rough. It's interesting to see some of, the children who are now a little older being able to speak about their experiences.
Yes, agreed. And of course, the most important people I think in this story are the victims, right? The survivors. The dictator was executed, but just I'd like to give you an example of the kind of things that happened to these completely innocent children. There was this culture of violence used to control the children because of course there are many more children than there are caregivers. There's one story about a night supervisor in an orphanage who caught some fifth graders arguing in their dorm room, and so as punishment he ordered them to hit each other and forced them to fight. There was a news story here in the U.S. A number of years ago about daycare centers doing some of the same things. The thing with the daycare center is that, horrible as that may be, those children were able to leave at night. The staff of these Romanian orphanages was beating everybody and then ordering larger children to hit smaller children. The survivors of these orphanages, if you'd like to learn more about them, created an association called Federei, Federeii. That is a Romanian epithet used for orphans that stems from a local term for a garbage dump. And the survivors and their allies and various NGOs are pushing Romanian authorities to admit to and apologize for this, the victimization of these estimated 500,000 children before the end of the Cold War. So yes, Tom, there are survivors, and we think it's worthwhile and important to make this a full episode because again, it's a story that I was not aware of. Matt, you and I were talking about this a little off air. I was not aware of outside of some horror stories I had read, like fictional horror stories. Horror fans, you'll remember, I'm sure, this series of books that came out that were called like the ultimate something. So like the ultimate werewolf, the ultimate vampire, the ultimate zombie kind of thing, and they had some great stories in these anthologies. And there's one in the ultimate vampire that takes place like in Romania as it's crumbling, and it's about these orphanages. And I don't want to spoil the story, but it was horrific enough that I simply assumed this was a particularly imaginative and macabre author. I was incorrect in this assumption because I went to the library and found out that yes, this did happen. It just didn't get a lot of reporting until I think in the West 2020 segment that ran in the 1990s. These people are, a lot of these people are very much alive and struggling with the lifelong consequences of this. Tom gave us a bait and switch as well, which I thought was interesting, Tom. I had to have a little bit of a gallows humor chuckle with you vicariously, because you guys heard that at the very end where Tom says, if this is too dark for the show, then I have another idea. Please look into Project 100,000. Project 100,000 is another thing that I had not heard of. This one I had no idea. I thought it might be one of those things like the Bat Bomb, or let's try to make cat spies, or let's put, submarine gear on a dolphin and just see what it can get into, right? This is not what Project 100,000 is.
No, it's not. I believe, what did you refer to it as in the outline, Ben? FUBAR?
Yes. Yeah, we're doing a lot of military acronyms today. Yes. Yeah, the Project 100,000 is kind of FUBAR. It was initiated by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara in the mid-60s because the Uncle Sam was in trouble in Vietnam. They didn't have enough manpower. They didn't have enough boots in the ground. They didn't have enough people. to send out to maybe die. And so what he did with this was to lower the recruiting standards of soldiers. So people who were not able to satisfy, in particular, mental standards, like cognitive standards, were now accepted. Were sent off to die, which is a very dark context in which to consider Forrest Gump. You know what I mean?
Exactly what I was thinking about with Forrest and some of the men that he was serving with. Huh.
So this had happened in other wars and in the U.S. as well, because people who scored lower in certain percentiles of mental aptitude tests, as they would be called, still got into service in World War II. But this eventually led to a hard legal floor. Your IQ had to be 80 to enlist. And of course, there's a multitude of problems with the IQ test anyway, as it stands then and as it stands now. You can't really measure something that you yourself cannot define or understand. And we have a very poor understanding of what intelligence is in general. But yes, it is true. It is unfortunately very true. And these people who were affected by Project 100,000, they still had to carry a lot of the same post-service burdens that other veterans carry, higher rates of divorce, higher rates of unemployment. They're also going to have, higher rates or lower rates of income and stuff. It's just a very messed up experiment. And really it can be, experts have described it as a failed experiment, and it was of little benefit to the people that it was maybe intended to help. If you want to say recruiting them in the Army was intended to help. So don't think we didn't notice, Tom. That is an equally troubling thing. And I'm wondering if that is an episode as well.